Few days ago I posted the video comparing these two cameras to test the new firmware of the Fuji XH2s, the firmware 7.10. I was using the Fuji XH2s with the Sigma 16mm 1.4 from one side and this Sony a6700 with a Sigma 16mm 1.4, and the video got lots of comments. Thank you a lot for watching that video. I was talking about the autofocus. I tried to set the cameras at the same exact settings, I mean in white balance as well as in exposure, and I noticed that there is a shift in white balance between these two cameras as well as a shift in exposure. Let's talk about it. Hello everyone, I hope you are all good. I'm Photorabs, a portrait photographer based in France, and I like creating on my channel some videos related to cameras, to anything related to photography and videography actually. So if you are interested in this stuff, I highly appreciate if you go subscribe to my channel. That's a massive help. And recently I made a video about this Fuji XH2s to try the new firmware update 7.10, especially the autofocus part of this firmware update. And I would like to mention that the tests that I do on my channel are related to my type of use. So basically how I use the camera, I try to make these tests, so I cannot cover all the aspects on all the cameras I have, because there are some other type of photography and videography that I don't do on a daily basis. So I cannot give you my opinion about that because I cannot master every single details in these cameras and in this kind of work. So just to keep it clear, to keep it transparent here, that's why I didn't test some other stuff on these cameras for this firmware update. And later on, when I came back to my computer, I edited the video, I noticed that we don't have the same white balance on the two cameras, although I set them exactly the same. And we don't have the same exposure on the two cameras, although I set exactly the same parameters on both of them, on the Sony a6700 and on the Fuji XH2s. I was using the same exact lens, Sigma 16mm 1.4 on both of them. So why we have this difference? Why we have this shift in exposure? Why we don't have the same exposure value if we are at ISO 400 on both of these cameras? This is the main question of today's video. These two cameras, they have APS-C sensors, but the base ISO level for the Fujifilm is 160, while the base ISO for this Sony is 100. So what is ISO? This is the first question. Basically, ISO is how much you add like voltage to your sensor in order to increase the brightness of the image. This is what we call the gain of the sensor. This is the voltage gain of the sensor that you apply. By shooting with high ISO, you increase the brightness of the image, but you will add lots of grain to the image. And when you lower down the ISO, you get the cleaner image possible out of your camera. This is mainly the role of the ISO in the camera. That's why it is recommended to shoot with the lowest ISO possible on your camera to have the clearer image possible without noise. Unless you are in a dark scene where you have to crank up your ISO to get some image, to get some usable image. But here we are talking about two different companies, the Fujifilm from one side and the Sony from another side. So these two companies, they have different perspectives of how their sensors are made and what is the base voltage applied to the sensor. For that, they have a base ISO on the Sony 100 and a base ISO on the Fuji 160. And when I made my tests, I noticed that at ISO 400, the Sony was way more exposed than the Fuji. The Fuji was darker and so on. So this is when I try to understand a little bit what's happening. So I made some other tests comparing the same exact ISO on these two cameras here in my home studio setup. This might not be very important to you, but if you are using two cameras from different brands, you have to understand how they expose the sensor. Even if you are using the same parameters, you might not have the same exact exposure value on the image. even though you have everything set the same way on the back screen of your cameras. And this is very important because, for example, I have a Fuji here filming me with this angle, and normally I have the Sony from the other angle, and I have another Sony for my top-down camera. So I have three cameras, three categories of the cameras, and I have to understand what is the base ISO level and how it affects my image. After making my tests, I decided just to compare the base ISO of the Fuji to the base ISO of the Sony, 100 on the Sony, 160 on the Fuji, and I got somehow good results. We don't have much difference in exposure. You can see that on the screen, and let me know your thoughts about that down below. So I tried also to test some other exposure values, some other ISO values on these cameras, keeping the Sony 2/3 of a stop lower of the Fuji, and I got somehow good results. The image, the exposure was somehow comparable between them both, even though we don't have exactly the same exposure value, but we have somehow very close results between these two cameras. So if you are using two cameras and you would like to match the exposure on them both, the most useful tip I can give you is to use the base ISO on both of them as the 0 level, and from that you can increment the value 1/3 of a stop, 2/3, 1 stop, and so on. So you keep the base ISO as the 0 level, and from that you start to crank the ISO up. In this way you are somehow sure to have the same kind of exposure on your image. So that was it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative and helpful. If so, don't forget to give me a like under this video, to subscribe to my channel, and to ring the bell so you will not miss my upcoming videos. And thank you for watching. Ciao for now.